Welcome to the Graduate Job Podcast, your home for weekly information and inspiration to help you get the graduate job of your dreams.
Welcome everyone to the Graduate Job Podcast with your host, James Curran. The Graduate Job Podcast is your weekly home for all things related to helping you on your journey to finding that amazing job. Each week I bring together the best minds in the industry, speaking to leading authors, entrepreneurs, coaches and bloggers who bring decades of experience into a bite-sized weekly 30-minute show. Put simply, this is a show I wish I had a decade ago when I graduated. This week I'm joined by one of my most popular guests, career coach and best-selling author John Lees, as we delve into his new book, The Success Code. John shares his expert advice on the tips, tricks and strategies you need to employ to ensure that your job search is a success. We explore why you need to think about self-projection and not self-promotion as you look for a job, why you definitely shouldn't be trying to sell yourself, and the power of asking questions. No matter where you are in your job search, this is an episode you won't want to miss. As always, all links we discuss and a full transcript are available in the show notes at graduatejobpodcast.com/success. Before we start, a quick request from me. Your feedback helps me to create the episode you want to hear, so I've set up a super simple and very quick survey as I want the show to best serve your needs. It's got 5 questions and it will take you just 1 minute, so please check it out at graduatejobpodcast.com/survey. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, but in the meantime, let's crack on with the show. Before we start though, I want to welcome today's sponsor, which is careergym.com. Career Gym is the #1 place for you to undertake all of your psychometric tests which you will face when you apply for a graduate job. You can practice verbal, numerical and abstract reasoning tests, all produced by experts and exactly the same as the ones you will see in the real tests. You can just practice them, or you can do them in exam mode under time pressure, and they come all with detailed explanations and solutions, and you can track your progress and see how you compare against your peers. I've been recommending the site for years to the clients I coach, and it comes very highly recommended. What's even better is if you use the code GJP, that's capital letters GJP for Graduate Job Podcast, you will get 20% off all of their tests. You can't say fairer than that. So head over to careergym.com, that's career and gym, G-Y-M, and use the code GJP to get 20% off and start practicing today. Now on with the show. I'm very pleased to welcome back to the Graduate Job Podcast career expert and best-selling author of How to Get a Job You Love and his new book, The Success Code. Welcome, John Lees.
Thanks very much. Good to be with you.
John, can you believe it's just over a year since you first appeared back in episode 16 when we covered How to Get a Job You Love, and it's still one of my most popular episodes today.
Brilliant.
And today we're going to touch upon your new book, The Success Code. As a way of introduction, could you briefly describe the book and why you wrote it?
Yeah, when I was asked to look at the topic of personal branding by a publisher, and it really struck me from a lot of the work that I've been doing with clients and with different audiences, how many people have come up to me at the end of a presentation and say, I know I need to be speaking to people, but I just don't know how to do it, and I don't like talking about myself. So I thought, well, I'll try and write a book that is not about personal branding, but it is actually about self-projection, about communicating well, but doing it in a style that almost anybody can adopt and try out, and a style that feels authentic as well.
And I really, really enjoyed the book. And listeners, check out the show notes at graduatejobpodcast.com/success, where I'll link to the book and everything we discussed today. And what I really liked about the book, John, is some of the books I've read on personal branding tend to be more from a, say, American perspective, and it's very, in your face and go out there and, you can do it. And this is, a lot more enjoyable. It resonated with me just from a British perspective of maybe being a bit more reserved initially and thinking about how I could project myself and from that side of things. Yeah. So in terms of areas for us to cover initially, maybe as you discuss in the book, you talk about the difference between self-promotion and self-projection. Could you kick us off with discussing what you meant by that?
Yeah, well, I've been a bit cheeky using the term self-projection because projection is a technical term in psychology. But what I was trying to do is think of a way of saying, well, how do we actually talk about ourselves authentically. And I thought, well, it is a sort of self-projection in the sense of projecting onto a screen. You're putting an image out there. But I wanted to make a distinction between that self-promotion, which is usually people endlessly talking about themselves and drawing attention to themselves and taking up more than their share of a conversation. And self-promotion can easily be linked to almost a kind of narcissistic view of the world, really, that says that I'm the most interesting thing and therefore nothing else should get my attention.
It's interesting you said that. I was speaking with one of my clients I coach last week, and they were in an interview and they've been doing really well, and they said the question that really threw them was, tell me about yourself.
Yeah.
And she said that without realizing it, she'd started talking about her boyfriend and what her boyfriend was doing and things that they went to together. And she found it very difficult to, just to try and talk about herself and how to sell herself.
Yeah, well, there's two important things there. I think one is that we'll be talking about some other strategies today, and including asking good questions of people and getting a conversation going rather than constantly talking about yourself. But there does come a point, and particularly in a job interview, where somebody says, well, tell me about you, or what are you looking for, or why are you here today? So it is fairly important that we kind of do a bit of thinking ahead to think about how you're going to manage those moments and say something which is relatively well rehearsed. You know, it reminds me of the kind of, when you look at stand-up comedy and the way they deal with hecklers, for example, those little bits of spiel are very well rehearsed, and they know exactly how they're going to do it. So a lot of material that we see out there in performance world that looks improvised and natural is actually very carefully rehearsed. So yeah, I mean, nobody should be surprised by that question at interview, and if you are surprised, it really does mean you haven't put any thought into what the process is going to feel like.
When you do rehearse those bits to talk about yourself, should it be a conscious effort to sell yourself? You talk in the book about the need to try not to sell yourself and for it to be more a conversation.
Well, if you talk to almost any audience at the moment who are thinking about either looking for a job or changing their career in some way, two bits of advice you can guarantee that they will have received in the last 2 weeks will be to get out there. Now, whatever that means, get out there. Somehow that kind of explains itself. And the other bit of advice is to sell yourself. And the worrying thing about telling somebody to sell themselves, if that's not their natural style, is that they'll either ignore the advice completely and hide, or they'll try it once and be very disappointed with the results, and then adopt a much more self-effacing approach. So it's not as if we say, well, I'll do 20% of it or 40% of it. It's an all or nothing thing, and I really understand that because I think it's the wrong message for people. I'll tell you why. I mean, the reason why is that there's huge amounts of research around, as well as anecdotal material, that say that people actually dislike being sold to. They like being engaged in conversation, but they hate being on the receiving end of a sales pitch.
And that, you completely agree. And when people, especially when you're at forums where people are trying to specifically sell you something, you do have that instant recoil back from it because it's not a two-way conversation. It's them just trying to push something that you probably don't want. So thinking then about the conversation, what does that mean then from a graduate point of view, where you might not be in a position where it's easy to have conversations with people who are going to be able to do the hiring, specifically if you're applying online and through the big milk round?
I think part of that is about encouraging people at that stage in the marketplace to spend a lot more time having research conversations. So I don't mean about academic research. I mean informational interviews or discussing organizations and sectors and lines of work with people. And some of those doors are relatively easy to open. And it still amazes me how many graduates don't really tap into the Alumni Network. Now, the advantage of talking to people and asking questions like, how did you get into your line of work, and what's going on for your organization at the moment, and what are the major changes in your sector. The advantage of all that stuff is you get used to asking good questions, And then you also get used to talking about yourself, because it's quite natural that someone will say after talking to you for maybe 20 minutes, well, tell me about you. What are you studying? What are you doing? Where do you want to get to? So you, again, start to learn to be ready for that moment where you can say something which is your own language. It's not cheesy. It's not a pitch. And it's a summary of the most important things you're doing at the moment and what you're looking for as well.
It's a really good point about the Alumni Network, and with tools like LinkedIn, it's so easy to just to tap into it and to find out who are the people that have been to your university who are doing interesting things that you want to do.
Yeah, well, I would say it's a pre-contracted arrangement. And what I mean by that is, if I'm in an alumni network and somebody rings me up and says, I'm in the same network as you, can I have 20 minutes of your time? I pre-contracted to say yes to that conversation. It needs no further explanation. All right, if I'm really busy, I might say no. But most of the time, people know what it's about, and you don't need to over-explain it. So it's an amazingly good resource, but maybe for the reasons I've just explained, that it also gets you used to asking intelligent questions, digging around, and being prepared for that moment where you have to say something about yourself and why you're interested.
I love the comment in one of the quotes in your book, and you say, it's not about who you know, it's who you choose to get to know.
Yeah, and I really firmly believe that. And I'm really don't accept it when people say, well, this is networking and it's only for people who are well connected or middle class or middle aged or male, or, because I know people from every age range and right across the social spectrum who do this quite naturally, and I've also seen people learn to do it in their own style and get some great results.
So working through that example then, so say if you do begin to tap into the alumni network and have conversations with people who are doing a job that you might want to do, would you recommend that people begin to go into that with a set spiel or pitch that they would give people, or would it be more natural in how they would approach the conversation?
Well, in the early stages, it's probably a misunderstanding of the process to think that you need to have some kind of presentation speech or an elevator speech. But it is natural to understand that people are curious and they want to know about you. So what we're really doing, I think, is to sort of start to deconstruct that idea of sell yourself, because it's the wrong model, because people don't like to be sold to. It makes people sound inauthentic. There's lots of research around that shows how people actually feel slightly grubby and doing that kind of thing. So what can you do? Well, you can first of all learn to ask great questions, because that's actually it's much easier to start a conversation with a question than a statement. It's people like to communicate about themselves and like to be invited to do so. When you're talking about yourself, though, particularly at that exploratory stage, it makes no sense at all to start saying I'm really good at this, and these are my strengths, and these are my values, all the kind of cliched stuff that people are being taught to deliver. And it's very hard to do. It feels wrong and it sounds wrong. And what I recommend people to do in my book and in my training programs as well is to talk about what they're interested in. So talk about what they've been studying, talk about the organizations and the people and the products and the ideas and the approaches that they've found really stimulating and inspiring. Talk about other organizations that they've been to see. Talk about anything that fires up a bit of energy, because people remember energy a lot longer than they remember information. So being an energized communicator is, it's one of the things that really starts to open doors.
And that energy, what you talk in the book about the people thinking about personal branding and what their personal brand would, that then become a component of someone's personal brand.
Yes, it is. That's right, and it's strangely so much easier to do, because somebody said on Radio 4 this week that the problem about working in an age where everyone is a knowledge worker, and I think that's broadly true, is that when you talk about yourself and your work, it's very difficult to separate that from your identity. So in a job interview, if somebody is questioning your skill level, because knowledge is very close to us, as it's close to ourselves, we feel personally attacked. So for that reason, it actually feels odd for most people to say, I'm really good at this. And in fact, it's probably the worst thing to say anyway, because that immediately invites a challenging response or an incredulous response. But if you say, I'm really fascinated by this, who do you know that I could be talking to at the moment, then it's much easier to respect and even get carried along with that kind of enthusiasm.
How then can you begin to change and carry this forward from a face-to-face meeting people face-to-face to bringing that message across into your online and written communication, particularly thinking CVs and online applications, which will be the way that the majority of listeners might be applying for jobs, especially for the big firms. How can you almost think about your personal brand and your message and try and convey that in a confident way without feeling like you're selling yourself when you might not have too many words?
Yeah. It's about being original and authentic, and I also respect the fact that both of those pieces of advice are quite hard to follow. I mean, it's a bit like before you go to a job interview, somebody says to you, just be yourself. That is actually a totally unhelpful piece of advice, because in fact you're not yourself in either of these contexts. Writing a CV, presenting yourself online, or any more than you are in a job interview, it's a kind of performance. So one of the ways into that is to start to understand what it's like for people who have to process vast quantities of this material. And what it's like for them is that they respond badly to people who oversell themselves. They respond badly to cliché. They also frequently report to people like me that the best evidence is often hidden away or not even revealed until a candidate turns up for interview. So here's a simple technique that I would use with many of my clients, and that is just to sit down with a friend and get that friend to ask you the question, what would you like an employer to know about you? And just brainstorm it. Just talk and let them write it down. And particularly the things that you know that make you an energized person. I don't really mind whether that's from work, play, study, any part of your life. You're going to end up with maybe a list of 20, 30 bullet points there. Then it's your job to filter that down and to say, which parts of that do I want to prioritize? How can I get maybe the best half a dozen of those pieces of information to form the top end of a CV and to also populate the first part of my LinkedIn page? So it's a process of filtering down so that you find things which are interesting to an organization and relevant, and also pitched in a language which is that you're relatively comfortable with, that you can stand behind if somebody interrogates it.
I think that's brilliant advice, and I really loved in your book you talk about the same exercise with a CV, handing your CV to someone and getting them to not even look at the CV but to ask the same questions, what message do you want to convey, and then just seeing what they've put in the CV, does that reflect to anything you've just mentioned in terms of the message that you want to convey? And when I've done that with clients, you find the answers normally no. They're talking about very different things, whether it's what they were doing at school when they were 15 as opposed to something that might be relevant to the employer.
Yeah.
I really like, you also mentioned in the book about asking yourself, what does this person need to know in order to commit to the next step as a question? Why is this a good one to ask?
Well, I'm not sure it's a question that you would ask aloud in an interview, but it's certainly a question you ask yourself. And the reason it's important is that, particularly with early screening interviews, and that could include telephone interviews, or it could even include the screening of your CV, people have a relatively short list of the things that they're looking for. So, a little bit of time spent interrogating job advertisements, job descriptions, and vacancy briefs, and all those kind of things, just to say to yourself, what's the top half a dozen items here? What are the boxes that absolutely have to be ticked in order for me to progress further? Now that's one way of looking at the basics. And the other one, of course, is to say, well, if the better you can decode a job, the greater your chances of speaking a language that the employer not only understands but finds exciting. And you can't guess at that. And in fact, this is again why reaching out to people is so important. Because if you're applying for a role or you're applying for a graduate scheme, if you can talk to somebody that's already on it or was on it 2 years ago, when they tell you about their experience, what they're effectively doing for you is decoding that and saying to you, this is the kind of language that selectors are going to respond well to. This is the way to package your evidence. None of us can do that without putting in the groundwork, which is way, way more than just reading an employer's website. It really pays dividends to spend some time just asking questions of the right people.
And as you mentioned, in conversations like that, the focus of the conversation isn't on yourself and needing to sell yourself. It's on asking the questions and almost being a sponge and soaking the information up from them.
I think there are very few occasions where you really need to sell yourself, unless an employer is specifically drilling you on the level of your skill. And you'll know that because they'll keep asking the question. They'll look for examples, for evidence, and what they're really doing is saying, okay, you've named a skill, now I want to know what the level is, I want to see some hard evidence that you've used it. Now that's fine, because that's actually not selling at all. That's information based on your experience, and if you haven't pre-packaged those narrow tips before you go into an interview, then you're taking a huge risk.
So moving on then to an interview situation, what advice would you give people who are walking into the interview so they can make that instant impact in terms of their communication, but also their general demeanour, how they can impress when they walk in there?
Yeah, well, again, this is where people are sometimes coached to be quite assertive, almost aggressive, sometimes to actually deliver their elevator pitch without even being asked to do so, to sort of crunch somebody's hand in the firmest handshake possible. Now, most of that is either going to bounce very badly, or people are going to listen to the advice and never actually implement it because it feels wrong. When you're in an interview, you're effectively what you're trying to do to communicate in the opening minutes is the sense that you are going to be an easy person to interview. And that's it. Because behind that, of course, is the understanding that you may well be an easy person to employ. So one of the ways of doing that is to actually practice small talk. And I know it sounds crazy, but even if you're asked a question about the weather or traffic or your journey here or delays on the train or anything like that, 2 tips that seem to work very well. One is to speak in a voice which is audible and clear, because it's the first time you've used your voice in the room and people are listening very carefully to hear how clear and confident that is. And the second is to be relatively upbeat. So rather than complaining about the traffic, just saying it wasn't a problem and the instructions were very helpful and you got there on time, or whatever it is. So it's kind of, strangely enough, you can actually practice this very, very easily in lots of social situations, which is just to remember to be positive, clear, audible, and to just sound as if you're enjoying the experience.
What advice would you give people who completely agree with everything you've said, but maybe find it difficult to find or to think about what their authentic voice actually sounds like? So who they are, and they recognise that often the advice they've given, say for an interview, is be confident and walk in there, like you said, and big handshake, and they're not at that end of the extreme, and they're not at the very end, but they're not sure where they are in the middle.
Yeah, well, I suppose in a way that's a bit like taking somebody who's relatively quiet and saying, I want you to make a big public presentation. It's a huge leap in terms of ability. You could get that person to that point, but you're not going to get them there within 24 hours. So really taking someone that doesn't know how to talk about themselves and say you need to deliver a confident pitch is equally unrealistic. It is a good idea for individuals who feel that way to actually think about how they're going to have the warm-up stages. Now, you're not in a job interview. You're not given that. No, nobody says, well, we'll have half an hour and we'll just chat and it'll be very easy and then the real interview will begin. It starts cold. But there is another way you can do it, and this is actually, I mean, I cover this in the zone system in the book, because it just essentially says you start easy, and you start with people that are easy to talk to. And you do that not just to discover information, but also to practice talking. So you find people that you really trust, and you say, listen, I'm going to have to go to interviews. I'm going to have to do some small talks, so can I just practice, and I'm going to have to communicate some of my experience. So can I try it out on you? Can I practice with you? And you need people who will give you a little bit of tough love, but mostly encouraging, particularly at the beginning. And it helps if they're people who can also remind you of your strengths. So like a good coach would do, say, listen, I know you're really good at this, and you haven't mentioned that in your CV yet, and how about expressing this story in a much more positive way? So it's sort of gradual steps which allow somebody to reveal their strengths, the best bits of their experience, and just to do it through natural storytelling. And sometimes it helps have someone around who writes down your best phrases. So because if you've said it, then it's probably an authentic way of speaking for you.
That's a really good point. And you mentioned in the book, it's about stepping just to the edge of your comfort zone. You will learn to project yourself onto the world of work.
Yeah, I really believe in that, because I think, too much advice just essentially says go way outside your comfort zone, be somebody else, fake it. And that's just inappropriate advice. So if you can work out where the edge of somebody's comfort zone is, you can get people just to push on the edge of their behaviours as well and try things out, particularly with a bit of encouragement.
And as they keep on going to the edge, they'll find the edge just keeps on pushing a little bit further out and further out each time.
Oh, naturally. But, in a sense, you don't need to know that, do you, when you start? Because you're just trying things out. But yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, even I was doing an exercise in a workshop just yesterday where I got people just to explain one thing that motivated them in work and to go around the room and have that conversation with 3 or 4 different people. And just in 3 to 4 iterations of that piece of evidence, they were getting significantly better at it. So I say, if you can get that much better within 4 minutes, how much better can you get within just 3 to 4 days, of trying things out?
That's a brilliant point. And you touched upon the zone system earlier. Do you want to just maybe briefly just take us through what the zone system is and how you describe it in the book?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to bore you by going through all the zones, but I think, what I would say is that the principle behind them is that you're starting with people who are very supportive and who will actually give you direct feedback and bits of advice in terms of how you present yourself and how you talk about yourself, and at the same time talking to people about your questions. So let's say you want to discover about a particular sector of work. You're not going to go through the yellow pages or approach very senior people immediately. You might talk to former colleagues, people you studied with, friends of the family, who are somehow connected to that sector. And you try out a question technique with them, and you maybe have a bit of a script and you see how it goes. And the important thing about this initial group is that they're easy to approach. You don't need to have a script in your head when you pick up the phone to ask for some help. And later on, because you've practiced both asking good questions and talking about yourself to a small degree, when you are introduced to people that you've never met before, and that's an important link, that you never ring anybody cold, then you've actually got the skills at your fingertips. So in a sense, you can forget about your performance, and now you're focusing on the information, and you're focusing on the quality of the relationship. And relationships are really important in terms of being remembered and getting people to move you forward. So the top end of the zone, the deeper parts of the zone system, are of course talking to decision makers and talking to people who you've been passed on to. And that's actually where you get some of the best results, when you are now talking to people who are effectively strangers, but you've had warm introductions to meet them. So it's a step-by-step approach which really respects the fact that people dislike doing this stuff, but they see a need to do it. And it realistically reflects on the fact that we can get a lot better at doing this stuff fairly quickly, particularly if you take the pressure off by removing the idea that you have to sell yourself.
John, that's a really good point for us to maybe finish on, as time is unfortunately running away with us. But before we do finish, we just move to the weekly staple questions. Now, the pressure's on for you because I've got your answers from last year, so I'm expecting some fresh insights now. So to kick us off, what one book would you recommend that listeners read?
Well, I'm not sure how this is related to the needs of your listeners at the moment, but I'm going to recommend it and explain why. It's a book called In America, and its subtitle is Travels with John Steinbeck, and it's written by a Dutch writer called Geert Mak, M-A-K. Now, the great thing about this book is that he is following in the footsteps of John Steinbeck, who drove all the way around America some 50 years ago, and he's doing it now. And in the process of that, he is unpacking the way that America has developed in the last 20 or 30 years, and it's some fascinating insights which explain a huge amount about American politics and world events, and I highly recommend it.
Excellent, and that's a new one for me. But listeners, don't worry, it'll be linked to in the show notes. So check out the show notes at graduatejobpodcast.com/success. And John, what one website would you recommend our listeners to visit?
Well, I thought to myself, well, what website do I visit fairly frequently for a whole range of information and ideas? And it's one that I write for occasionally, and it's hbr.org. This is Harvard Business Review's online offering, and because I've written for it, I know how tightly and how carefully all of the blogs and articles are edited, and there's a huge amount of resource there in terms of straightforward things like careers advice, but all kinds of background information about businesses and people stuff, and it's a very, very distinctive and impressive offering at the moment.
Excellent. And is that one that you need to subscribe to, or is it open to the general hoi polloi?
It's open to anyone. I think you have to sign up, but there's no charge to do so, as far as I remember.
Oh,
as far as I remember, you might want to check that out and put that in your notes as well.
I will do, and I'll also try and find John's article so you can link directly to the good stuff on there. And finally, John, what one tip would you leave listeners with today that they can implement on their job search straight away?
Well, I would say if you've liked anything of what we've been talking about today, try it out. You don't have to try out 100 things. You don't have to do all of it, but have a go. Because if not having a go, it's a bit like somebody watching Bake Off on television and saying, those people are so good at this, I'm never going to turn my oven on. I never reach that standard. Well, they don't do that, do they? They say, well, I think I'll go and make some scones. So try one thing and try it for yourself.
Definitely. And if you do get good at scones, then send one my way. I'd love to try them out. John, thank you very much for appearing on the Graduate Job Podcast. Before we finish, what is the best way for people to get in touch with you and the work that you do?
Just to visit my website, www.johnleescareers.com, or if you simply Google John Lees Careers, that'll find me.
John, thank you very much for appearing on the Graduate Job Podcast.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks again to John Lees. It was a pleasure to have him back on the show, and he was as informative, insightful and debonair as always. Now, lots to take in over the half hour, but one biggie stood out for me. As I mentioned in the show, I love John's comments. It's not who you know, but who you choose to get to know. Now, you might not have been born with connections, but don't let that hold you back. Through the internet, Twitter, LinkedIn, or a simple email, you can reach out to anyone and find out what they did to get where they are now. As Tony Robbins says, model someone who is already successful, because success leaves clues. So, dear listener, your task for today is to utilize your alumni network and to reach out to 5 people who are doing a job that you would like. Then when you do, follow John's advice and discover the power of asking questions. Make sure, though, you let me know how you get on. Drop me a mail at hello@graduatejobpodcast.com or hit me up on Twitter @gradjobpodcast. So that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Check out the show notes for everything we've discussed and a full transcript. If you've enjoyed the show, please head on over to iTunes and leave a review. It helps us stay high in the rankings and for listeners to find us. Make sure you listen next week when I have Raghav Haran on the show as we discuss how to land any job you want with no experience. It's a goodie. I hope you enjoyed the show today, but more importantly, I hope you use it and apply it. See you next week.